Well, we are starting a new series on the life of David. We'll be working through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's called the David story or the David cycle. And I titled it A Man for All Times because I think what you're going to see, even in this first lesson, you're going to see an unbelievable amount of parallels between David's life 3,000 years ago and the spiritual and political and social circumstances of 21st century America and our world, but particularly America. So, as always, we're going to dive in with a little context. And in this episode 1, we talk about Israel, where Israel came from, and got to the point where Israel asked God for a king. So let's do a little bit of context. For that, of course, we need a map. So I want to take you back to 1400 BC. Oops, my fault. So we're going to be in 1400 BC. I just need to sync this. Sorry about that. There we go. So 1400 BC, the Israelites leave Egypt. They're here. And they make their way to Mount Sinai. So I'm just writing on the maps. You can see the geography of this and the time frame of this. When they get to Mount Sinai, Moses, you may remember this is the book of Exodus. Moses and the Israelites stop there, a short way into their journey to the promised land, the land of Canaan. That's what it was called in that time, is the land of Canaan. And they stop there, and Moses goes up on the mountain. And what really happens there is more than just the 10 commandments being given to Moses. You take these 12 tribes of Israel, literally the 12 tribes of Jacob, whose name was Israel, and this large group of people, and they make a covenant relationship with God. We call that the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Basically, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those 5 books in the Old Testament are called the Law of Moses. But what it really is it's a covenant of obedience, a covenant of love, a covenant of God choosing this group of people. And so this group of people becomes defined. Israel becomes defined by their relationship and their covenant with God. They certainly don't become defined by economic policy. They have none. They don't become defined by their military prowess. They have no military. They don't become defined by their nation, because right now they're going to spend 40 years in wandering. And so their definition of Israel is all about the relationship with God. And rabbis throughout all of history to this day realize that what makes the Israelite people, or the Jewish people, as we tend to refer to it today, unique is that covenant with God. So they go from there, they go into this wilderness, it's actually a desert, and they spend 40 years, a whole generation, in this desert. And I like to say that it took God very little time to get the Israelites out of Egypt, but it took him 40 years to get Egypt out of the Israelites. In other words, to teach them to trust him. Remember, they had the manna every morning. They were helpless on their own. They couldn't support themselves, and yet God sustained them in the wilderness. When they left there, they made their way through some of the territory of their traditional enemies, Edom, Moab. You'll see some of these nations come again, and they get to the border of the Promised Land, and this is where you see the book of Joshua, who takes them into the Promised Land, and then we move into the time of Judges, and that's what I want to show you next. So this is time period. This is around, I'm really rounding these dates off. So 1400 BC, as Israel prepares to enter the land, this is the allotment of the land. In other words, God says each of the 12 tribes have land. Now go and drive out the people from this land I promised your forefather Abraham 600 years earlier. And so this is where they were supposed to settle. What happened? Well, as you read the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, you realize that their faith failed them, and they were only partly successful. So this map that shows you the allotment of the tribes, they didn't actually conquer all this land. Let me show you what reality looked like. For example, notice the tribe of Dan. Beautiful land on the coast, back over close to, I'm going to highlight Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not a Jewish city anytime during this whole lesson, by the way, but you know where it is. And so basically, Dan had this territory, but Dan never occupied that territory. They were huddled together on a few hills trying to eke out a living because the Philistine cities were Ashkelon, Gaza, which is today Gaza, Ashdod, Gath, and then Ekron's not on this map. But basically, they had this whole area, the Philistines. And so Dan, that whole tribe, failed and moved, and you see this city, Dan, in the far north, that wasn't their territory, but they were so unsuccessful and so unfaithful, and the Philistines so oppressed them, they were starving. Even though Samson, who was of the tribe of Dan, was able to defeat the Philistines for a little while, they never could sustain it. And so they literally moved all the way up north of the Sea of Galilee, and that's where their land became. So I want you to get the idea that even though this is what God told them to do, their lack of faith made them somewhat unsuccessful in doing it. And so from 1400 all the way down to the time of our story, and our story is going to begin about 1050 BC. This is the time of the Judges. In your Old Testament, the book of Judges covers this time period. What was happening in the book of Judges? Well, they were still kind of trying to defeat their enemies, but they were kind of settling for less than what God had told them they wanted. And every now and then, God would raise up a judge, a hero, like a Samson, like a Gideon, like Deborah. And they would rise up and they would unite the people and they would accomplish some things, and then the tribes still wouldn't effectively continue it. And so they spent that almost 400 years approximately living in that manner. And so that brings us to the beginning of our story. Our story picks up in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we're going to do about 7 or 8 chapters, 8 through 15 is this story that I'm going to tell you. So let's see how our story opens. In 1 Samuel 8, when Samuel grew old. Now, who is Samuel? Samuel is the last of the judges. The first 7 chapters tell you about his early life. I would urge you to read them. But since this is about David, I want to go ahead and get to the first king and Samuel and Saul and set the stage for David so you'll understand what he's coming into. But basically, Samuel is the last judge. He's the last leader ordained by God. God spoke to him. He was able to rally the Israelites and lead them. And when he became old, his sons, however, didn't follow in his footsteps. And so because the Philistines were so strong and their enemies around them were so strong, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. His sons were Joel and Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons didn't walk in his ways. They weren't faithful. They turned aside after dishonest gain. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. And so all the elders of Israel, the rulers of the tribes, the leaders of the tribes, gathered together, came to Samuel, and they said, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us." I'm going to highlight this, such as all the other nations have. Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. What's happening here? Israel is a people defined by their covenant relationship with God. They've already failed to do what God told them to do. Their faith is failing, and now it's like their allegiance switches, and they say, maybe our problem is we need to be more like these nations all around us. This great quote from Peter Leithart: Israel was called to be distinct from the nations. This is part of their charter. God said, I've chosen you as a people, a holy priesthood. You're to be a light to the nations, to all the other countries. You're to show them what holiness, what faithfulness to God looks like. They were called to be distinct. Their national life was organized around the covenant at Sinai. One more. Walter Brueggemann says this: the problem, though, that they faced over this kingship issue is how to integrate the reality of a social crisis into Israel's dominant theological perspective. So what are we actually saying here? Here's the problem. They know that they're in a covenant relationship with God, but they're having problems in political, social, economic life. They've got these enemies. They don't seem to be able to defeat them. They're not bold enough to trust God and just go into battle. And so instead, they're trying to work things out on their own, and it's not working. They're basically not dealing with their life situation very well. And instead of turning to God, they come to the conclusion, maybe we just need to be more like these other nations. And if we had a king to raise an army and rally us and lead us, now think about this. God said to Samuel, he said, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. God is their king. And yet, here they say, maybe we need a king like the other nations around us. And so this is a crisis of faith, and this is a turning point. It's a turning point of their allegiance. Here's an interesting faith lesson that I just want to put this marker in the ground and have you hold this thought. Through all of time, I mean, it doesn't matter if we're in 1050 BC or if we're in 2020 America, AD, the cultures around us will always compete for our allegiance. It's not a matter, there's never been a neutral government in the history of humanity. And I don't say this to condemn government, but my point is governments aren't neutral. Governments are never perfect in that I'm here to love God and punish evildoers. This is Romans 13, punish evildoers and reward those who do well. Governments, the power inherent in government always ends up being a competitor for God's people's allegiance. That's what's happening here. They said, you know what, we could trust God or we could maybe get a king and be like them. Do you remember when Jesus said, remember they brought Jesus the coin and said, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he said, whose picture is on the coin? And they said, well, Caesar's picture's on the coin. And Jesus said, then give to Caesar what's Caesar's, but give to God what's God's. Now, you may think that that meant all the earthly stuff is Caesar's and all the spiritual stuff is God's. Oh no, Jesus is far more clever than that. What Jesus was saying is everything is God's. Caesar just thinks he's the Lord. And so my point is governments throughout all of history, including 2020 America or any government in the world, always competing for your undivided loyalty, your undivided allegiance. And that's what's happening in Israel at this time. And so they ask God for a king. And so Samuel goes to God, and God says, yes, I'll give them what they want. Well, that's scary, by the way. Whenever God says, are you sure that's what you want? And you go, oh, that's what we want. Sometimes God says, well, then I'll give you what you want, and you'll be back. And that's exactly what happens to Israel. And so here's what Samuel says to them. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. And he said, this is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. In other words, he's going to have an army. They will run in front of his chariots. Some he'll assign to be commanders of thousands and fifties. Others will plow his ground and reap his harvest. In other words, to support the government. Still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants, to his ministers, your men servants, maid servants, the best of your cattle and donkeys, he'll take for his own use. Welcome to taxes. That's what he's talking about. You will be taxed to support your king or government. I'm going to use those two interchangeably because we don't use the term king now. He said, basically, when that day comes, you're going to cry out for relief from the king that you wanted, and the Lord will not answer you. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. I mean, if you just think about that, they were called to be distinct, and what's their greatest desire? We just want to be like everybody else. And so, with a king to lead us and to go out and fight before us and to fight our battles for us. So, you get this idea of Israel being defined by a covenant, but because of circumstances, they've changed their allegiance. And I've told you that whatever government you have, whatever power structure, typically in the form of governments in our world, are always sooner or later going to compete for your allegiance to any other god, to any other thing. And here's the lesson for the church today. I just want to stop here before we go on with our story, because we are much like ancient Israel in this one respect. God's people, and when I say that today, I mean the church, those who are believers in Jesus Christ, people who have surrendered themselves and follow Christ. Whatever wording you want to use, those who are saved. I mean, we use a lot of phrases, but what I mean by that is those who have died to sin and live to Christ, those who are following Christ. We are in a covenant relationship with God. We are the people of the book. The New Testament, it means literally the new covenant. We are a covenant people with God. And just like the Israelites, our circumstances press us as well. And so the church in the world today is not a nation defined by economics. I mean, you have Christians all over the world in all different nations. Not a nation defined by military. Christians don't even have a military. Not a nation defined by geography. Again, there are Christians in every part of the world, in different nation states in our world today. We are defined by a covenant relationship with God. And we face, this is one way I'd like you to think about what's happening to us today. We face the exact same circumstance. Our enemies don't happen to be called Philistines or Amalekites or Ammonites. Our enemies tend to be called the materialism of this world, the pressure of secular ideology. We fight a battle that is less physical, although unfortunately becoming more and more physical, but basically we also are being pressed by our culture, and we face the same challenge. Will our allegiance remain with God, or will our allegiance turn to the world? And how will we know that happens? We know that happens when we begin to put our trust in political solutions to our spiritual challenges. What happened to Israel? They said, yeah, we've got God, but boy, those Philistines, their swords are awfully sharp. And their allegiance shifted to a political solution. Give me a king, get an army, rather than allegiance to God. I think we as the church, this is a powerful lesson to me, what happens to Israel here, because it's a cautionary tale. I don't know if you've thought about it before, but we literally are in the exact same circumstances. Our enemies just have different names. And they just don't come with swords, they come with something sometimes sharper. There's some pretty sharp tongues out there. There's some pretty oppressive policies out there. Our battle is the same. When we begin to look to political solutions to our spiritual problems, then our allegiance has also shifted. And I think that's a cautionary tale for the church in the world today. So let me show you what they end up getting out of this. This is a map you'll see many times. It's a good one. Their first king is Saul, whom you're about to meet. But you see this area in gray? That's what I'm circling on this map. Not very big. And that's not actually Saul's kingdom. I mean, it is on this map, but kind of like the allotment of the tribes, you're going to see a battle with Philistines in a minute that's right in the middle of that territory. So theoretically, that little area was Saul's kingdom, the kingdom that Israel had. Even so, they were barely able to hold that. And then as time goes on, you'll see that by the end of David's reign, the green area, and then by the end of Solomon's reign, that whole area. And by the end of Solomon's reign, that land of Israel is exactly what God promised Abraham in 2000 BC. But for now, Saul's just trying to beat off the Philistines, and I want to show you some of their enemies. So you see Philistia, the Philistines, in other words, are here on the coast, and they control all this good land. You have the Edomites, who are in modern-day Jordan. You have the Moabites, the Ammonites. You have the Syrians in the north, and you have Amalek in the desert to the south. So not much has changed for Israel, has it? You look at that map and you say, oh my gosh, those guys are surrounded by enemies. Welcome to 2020, right? Bottom line is, all of these enemies are attacking. They all want this land. They all want the Israelites out. And so the Israelites say, give us a king who's going to defend us, who's going to carve out a place where we can at least feed our families. So that's where this geography is happening. So let's go on and let me introduce you to their first king. There was a Benjamite, meaning of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin's area, by the way, was right by Jerusalem, just a small area right in the center, right by Jerusalem. A man of standing whose name was Kish. And he had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. I mean, he held almost every rushing and receiving record in high school football in early Israel. I mean, this guy's a specimen, right? When Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel together, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. Then he brought forth the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and the lot fell on Matri's clan, and finally Saul, the son of Kish, was chosen to be their king. They thought that this was God's design, and it was. God had said, you want a king? I will give you a guy that he's got every qualification you could have. He's big, he's strong, he's a brave warrior, which Saul was. He's handsome, he's taller, he has physical presence. In other words, they looked at him and they go, now that's a king right there. That guy will match up very well with all the other kings around here. And when they went looking for him, he wasn't found. He was in the baggage train. And so they brought him out, and as he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of the others. Samuel said to all the people, do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among your people. And the people shouted, long live the king. Then Samuel explained to the people the regulations for the kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people, each to his own home. And so Saul becomes king. And in the beginning, things go pretty well for Saul. Saul is a brave individual. He doesn't really know much about being king. In fact, the Israelites are new to this. But let me give you an example of one incident that happens. There was a town named Jabesh Gilead. And this town had a lot of people of the tribe of Benjamin there. And there was a king of the Ammonites. So they're coming just east of the Jordan River, where Jordan is today. And they came over and they surrounded this town. And so they sent word to him, and they said, we're about to destroy your town. And so the people in Jabesh Gilead said, you can read about this in Samuel, but it's quicker if I just tell you this, said to him, listen, you guys are too powerful. Let's make a treaty. You want taxes, you'll have taxes. We'll be your servants, whatever, but don't kill everybody. Well, the king of the Ammonites was a guy named Nahesh. Now, if that sounds like something Harry Potter would say, it is, because it means serpent. And he was not a nice guy. And you know the answer he sent back to them? He said, I will let you make a treaty with me under one condition. Every single man in your town comes out to me, and I will gouge out his right eye. And then I'll make a treaty, and you can pay me taxes, and I won't kill everybody. And so the men of Jabesh Gilead go, gosh, not what we were hoping for. You know, not exactly the world's best deal here. And so they sent word back and they said, all right, we're not going to surrender under those terms, but if we don't get help in 7 days, we'll be forced to. And so word goes out. And so Saul finds out about this, and Saul, the Spirit of God comes on Saul, kind of like one of the judges. And all of a sudden he rises up and he calls all of Israel together, and he goes there on the morning of the seventh day. He arrives with a superior force and destroys the Ammonites. And so Saul's kingship gets off to a good start, like, hey, we picked the right guy. This is going to be our king. But pretty quickly, we start to learn the lesson that what looks good on the outside, what looks good to the culture, and even more importantly, the things that make you successful in the world are not the things that make you successful in God's kingdom. But let me pause for a minute and see what questions we have about our narrative so far.
Does the map at the end of Solomon's time resemble what Israel is today?
Good question. The map at the end of Solomon's time, I'm going to go back to that right here. Got markings on it, but basically, if you notice, it goes all the way up to the Euphrates River, goes all the way down into Egypt. That is not what Israel looks like today. Let's see if I can pick another color. I'll pick a green, I hope it works. Israel today has the Golan Heights. They basically have all the way down until you get to the Sinai Peninsula, and then they come right up the Jordan River. So much, much smaller today than it was in Solomon's time. And then I don't have enough room to carve out the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But basically, good question, but no, it is today much smaller than what it was in Solomon's time. Good question.
Were the regulations for kingship that Solomon set out, or that Samuel set out, were they God's standards or someone else's? They're listed in 1 Samuel 10:25. It just says that he told the people rights and duties of kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it before the Lord.
Yes, Samuel as a judge, as a prophet. Think of Samuel less as a judge. That word means something different to us. Think of him as a leader anointed by God, as a prophet. Maybe prophet's a good word. He is considered to be wise, and he's considered to receive information from God. He wrote down to them, look, you've never had a king before. Here are some things to do. Those are godly principles, but they are not preserved for us. They do not occur in the Bible. This is Samuel making an accommodation for something God never planned. So it just came out, it appears to me that it just came out of his wisdom for, if you're going to have a king, these are the kind of things you need to do. Sort of like a Magna Carta, if you will, but we do not have that document. So, good question. Well, let's go on with our story. We'll pick up questions again in a little bit. But basically, Saul gets off to a good start, but you begin to see some hints really quickly of Saul's character, his spirituality begin to show through as the pressure comes up. In other words, they wanted a king so that they could defeat the nations. Well, they defeated the Ammonite king. Unfortunately, there are other enemies. So the Philistines assembled to fight Israel. They had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. The Philistines were the most technologically advanced group of people in this part of the world at that time. And the Philistines had more people, more armor, more anything than the Israelites did. In fact, I want you to file this away because it's going to be really important in about 4 lessons. The Philistines wouldn't let the Israelites have blacksmiths. In other words, there wasn't anybody in Israel. If they found them, they would kill them. And basically, if they wanted their plows sharpened, if they wanted their scythes sharpened, they had to go to the Philistines and pay them for that. The Philistines wouldn't allow them to have any technology. In other words, they couldn't make swords. They couldn't make shields. And so the Israelites, you can understand why they want a king. It's like, arm us, find a way, raise taxes, go buy some arms from somebody. In other words, they're looking to solve their worldly problems in a political way instead of relying on God. They'd won all the battles up to this point, all through Joshua, without advanced weaponry. Why? Because they relied on God, and God fought their battles for them. But now they've decided to solve this problem politically. And one of their big political problems is they're not well armed. So they're not much of a match. So they went, the Philistines went and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-Haven. And I'll show you this on a map in a minute. But the point of this is when the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and their army was hard pressed, they stood up and fought like men. No, they hid in caves among the rocks and in pits and in cisterns, and some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan. I mean, they left the country, okay? They're scared to death of the Philistines. Where's their faith now, by the way? They transferred their faith from God to their king, and now they don't even have faith in their king. They're running away from the Philistines. Saul remained at Gilgal. This is really close to where the Philistines are, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. What Samuel told him was, wait a week, I'll be there. We're going to sacrifice before the Lord and say, Lord, fight this battle for us. And so he waits the 7 days, but his men begin to desert. And so he said, bring me the burnt offering. And Saul made the offering to God. Well, he's not supposed to do that. He's not the priest. He's not Samuel the judge. But what's he afraid of? My men are leaving. I don't know how to deal with this. I better take matters into my own hand. Well, just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering, and that you didn't come when you said you would, and that the Philistines were assembling, I thought, now the Philistines are going to come fight us, and I haven't even asked God's blessing on this. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. So what you see with Saul is Saul, not only have the people put their confidence in him as the political leader, he's taken his confidence away from God, and he's trying to take matters into his own hands. So what happens here? Well, it turns out Saul's not essential in this battle at all. Saul's here at Gilgal. Change colors here. Saul's right here. Notice, by the way, this is Jerusalem. We're in the middle of Israelite territory, and they're fighting the Philistines. They're losing. They're losing to the Philistines. And the Philistines are here at Michmash. Well, Saul's son Jonathan is a young man who's a great warrior, just a great heart, who trusts in God. And he and his armor bearer go into the camp of the Philistines and kill 20 of them. The rest of the Philistines go, oh no, there must be an army here, and they begin to flee. And so Saul's army goes, they're running away. I think we should attack. And so all of a sudden they all get a bunch of courage, right? And so they begin to follow the Philistines. Who won this battle? Well, you could say Jonathan, but really, Jonathan trusted God to win this battle. Saul could have done this too, but Saul put his trust in his own hands, in his own methods. But his son Jonathan was bold enough to trust that God would deliver this day, and so God did deliver this day. So Saul fails in his faith, but the day is saved. Then God comes to Saul a second time, and he says to him, Samuel says, this is what the Lord Almighty says, I will punish the Amalekites. The Amalekites are the ones that live just south, for what they did to Israel as they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. This is a grudge that goes back 400 years. What happened was when Moses and the people were coming up, they said to the Amalekites, we're not here to attack you. We're just going around, and we're going to go to the land God gave us. The Amalekites, however, said, here's a lot of people, not a lot of weapons, and so they attacked them. And so they harassed the Israelites as they came by, and God said, today is the day when the Amalekites will be attacked, and I want you to totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Put everything to death, the cattle, the sheep, the camels, the donkeys, everybody. So Saul summoned the men, and he got them together, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. The Israelites are a large number of people here. They're just not a powerful group of people. So he takes those people, and so he went to the city of Amalek, their capital, and set an ambush. And then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. In other words, he routed them and he pursued them all the way south into Egypt This is over several days. He completely routed them, and everything they had belonged to him. And so he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. So he captures their king, and all of his people he destroyed. But Saul and the army spared the king, and they spared the best of the sheep and cattle, all the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. They were unwilling to completely destroy them, but they destroyed everything that was despised and weak, but they kept the very best things. What's happening here? They're having a hard time obeying what God is asking them. You see this failure of faith. And Saul is complicit in this. Instead of saying, no, the Lord told us to do this, we will put our trust in the Lord, we're going to do exactly what he said, he kind of did halfway what God said. Have you ever experienced that? That's another timely lesson for us. How many times do we hear what God has to say and we go, I think I'll do about half of that and hope he's grading on the curve, right? Well, that's what Saul was hoping for. Well, Samuel reached them and Saul said, the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. And Samuel says one of the funniest lines in the whole Bible. That's funny. Then what is that sound of sheep in my ears? What is the mooing of the cattle that I hear? And Saul says, oh, but the soldiers brought those from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle because we're going to sacrifice them to the Lord. But we destroyed the rest of them. How often does that sound like you're in my prayer life? God, I did what you wanted. Well, mostly. But I didn't do this part, but actually I was doing you a favor. I did that for you. Well, Samuel presses him and he says, you're giving me excuses. He said, is that really what happened? And Saul said to Samuel, he says, no, it's not. I have sinned. I violated the Lord's commands and your instructions. I was afraid of the people. Hey, you notice the pattern here? When we turn our allegiance from God to the people around us, what happens? People pleasing. He was more of a people pleaser than a God pleaser, wasn't he? He was afraid of his own troops. He didn't lead them, he followed them. And he said, well, they want to do this, I'd better do it. When they were leaving, he said, I guess I'd better do the sacrifice. When they won the battle, he said, I guess I'd better give them some of the bounty here instead of doing what God commanded. But he said, I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. And so you see this pattern with Saul. Now Saul's going to remain king for many more years, but Saul effectively has forfeited any authenticity that he has as king. He has no mandate anymore. The people have turned away from God. Saul hasn't brought them back. Saul's not relying on God. Saul's relying on his own management skills, right? And God says, then you're on your own. And the rest of Saul's life looks like Romans chapter 1. By the way, in the New Testament, you're thinking, does this ever happen in the New Testament? In Romans chapter 1 is basically the story of humanity in the New Testament. And here's what it says. It says, people loved this world more than they loved God. So, and God says this 3 times, God gave them over to the futility of their thoughts. God gave them over to their own desires and lusts. God gave them over to their own impure pursuits. And that's the whole idea, is this downward spiral of humanity as we pursue what we want. That's what's happening to Saul. His kingship starts good, and quickly you realize that his faith is weak. You know who he reminds me of? He reminds me of the strong man, Samson. Samson was very strong on the outside. Samson's faith was very weak. Samson's story is one of a strong man who physically defeated the Philistines for a while, but then became captured by the Philistines because of his own spiritual disobedience. Saul is the story of a king who has everything the world could look for in a successful king, and yet his spiritual lack of trust in God just deteriorates his kingship. And so by this point, God has rejected him. He will continue to be king for a while, but God has rejected him. And one of the great lessons at this point of the story is the difference, and I want you to hold this thought. This lesson is kind of setting some seeds that are going to grow in the future lessons. He makes excuses instead of repenting. Eventually, he says, you know what, I sinned, you got me. But basically, Samuel has to go through 3 or 4 excuses to get to it. And when you see David in the future, I want you to compare these two, because you're going to ask yourself later, David made mistakes too. What's the difference between him and Saul? And you'll see several, but here's the first one. David repented. Saul made excuses. Saul tried to justify his own behavior. And I don't know about you, but that rings true to me as well. That's been true in my life. There have been times when I've been confronted with my own sin, doing things that I know are not right. And yet, my first reaction is to rationalize it, is to make excuses why this is okay, rather than turning to God, who is faithful to forgive us. The Apostle John says, if we will simply confess our sins to him. Saul couldn't confess his sins. He needed to justify himself. And God said, then I'll turn you over to your own ways and your own methods. Samuel ends up saying this. This is one of the beautiful passages. He says, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices? Remember, he said, we saved all these people, all these cattle, because we're going to sacrifice them to the Lord. Well, that was a lie. But Samuel says, even if that were the case, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, or does he delight in your obedience? To obey is better than sacrifice. And that's a timeless lesson. To obey is better than sacrifice. And if you just take it out of its context, you get, well, do I have to obey God or do I have to do the sacrifices? Well, you have to do the sacrifices. The point is, Saul thought, I don't have to obey as long as what I'm doing is, it's really good for you, God, trust me. That's not the case. Samuel says, your obedience is what God desires. New Testament picks that up and takes it even further. We aren't required to sacrifice. We have the ultimate sacrifice in Jesus Christ. There's nothing really that we're asked to do for God. But Jesus said in John chapter 14 and 15, in fact, he said this 5 times, if you love me, you will obey my commands. The Lord desires our loving obedience to him, not the things that we do for him. We can't earn our salvation. We can't build up our merit with God by doing good deeds. Oh, we were created for good deeds. We just aren't saved by them. Obedience is our offering to God. And that's what Saul missed. So, what do we have? We have the Israelites coming into the land and failing because they don't trust God, and they fail to accomplish what God has asked them to do. When they get pressed by their enemies, instead of remaining with God who has brought them through the desert, brought them out of Egypt, in the book of Joshua, they won battles with no weapons. Think of Jericho, marching around Jericho and the walls fall down. God has fought their battles, and yet they decide we want to be like everyone around us. And I think that's an occupational hazard for us too as the church, is let's not look to political solutions to the world's fundamental spiritual ailments. And then Saul takes matters into his own hands and says, I'm going to do this my way instead of God's way. And when it doesn't work out, instead of saying, you know what, I was wrong, and I'm going to return to God, I'm going to repent, I'm going to turn around, he doubles down. He does self-justification. He makes excuses. And from that time on, God turns his face away, and Saul is on his own. And what you're about to see as David enters this story in our next lesson, you're about to see Saul spiral down as God brings a different kind of king into the picture. Make sense? Question?
1 Samuel 15:35 says that God regretted making Saul the king. Did God know the outcome in advance? And if he did, how did he regret that decision?
Good question. You managed to tap into a theological quandary that will take longer to answer than we have left. But that sounds like a cop-out. So I'm going to give you the short version of this. There is a lot of study around this idea of, wait a minute, if God indeed knows the future, then why would the scripture say something like, God regretted doing this? Two solutions that theologians typically come to, one of which is orthodox, one of which is not. The one that is not is the idea that, you know what, maybe God doesn't know everything that's going to happen. Maybe God doesn't know what you're going to eat for dinner tonight. I don't know either. But the point is, maybe God doesn't know that. That's not an orthodox answer to this question, but it is one that you will hear. A more traditional way to understand this, and one I'm convinced makes perfect sense to me. I mean, if I were writing the Bible, I would write it this way, is the Bible uses what's called these kinds of metaphors. I won't use the technical term for it, but these kind of metaphors. For example, when you read in the Psalms that God upheld me with his strong right arm. Well, do I really think that God has a strong right arm? I actually don't think that's what it means. But what does it mean? It means that God has the strength to uphold me spiritually, emotionally, physically even, and heal me, etc. But it uses this anthropomorphism, this idea of speaking to us in human terms as though God had a strong right arm. Well, he doesn't. That's not the issue. God is not corporeal. That's not the point. The point is, you understand what a strong right arm is. I'm going to use that, right? You see that all over Scripture. In fact, you don't even think twice about that. It doesn't make you say, oh my gosh, you know what? Maybe God looks like us. Maybe God is not spirit, like Jesus said. Maybe God looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm talking a pumped up right arm and say, that never even occurs to you to think that, does it? No, you realize he's obviously putting this in human terms. Anthropopathism is the word for doing that with non-physical attributes. So for example, when it says God regretted making Samuel king, you and I understand that. It's like, yes, it didn't fulfill my purpose. I regretted buying that Chevy Vega when I was 16 years old because it did not fulfill my dreams of winning any drag races in high school. It did not. I regretted it. Well, you and I understand, well, that's a human feeling, isn't it? Well, when I say God regretted it, do I really think that he's got those human feelings any more than he has a strong right arm? No, but what is the point? The point is Saul failed to fulfill the task that he was given. So that's a really short answer to that question, but I just want you to realize that language should be understood the same way the strong right arm is. It's trying to tell you something in human terms. It's not telling you that, oh no, God got surprised. God doesn't get surprised. So that's a great question, and I'm sorry for the short answer, but hopefully that helps a little bit to know what's happening. Well, in our next episode, we're going to meet David. David is as opposite in every respect that you can get from Saul. David's not a big, tall, strapping, strong guy. He's not, on the cover of GQ magazine, the most handsome guy. And he is going to go up against the Philistines, which Saul has failed. He's going to go up a boy against the strongest of the Philistines. That's not a coincidence, by the way, and we'll talk about it. So the people want the king. They get the world's perfect image of a king who turns out to be fatally flawed spiritually. God turns then, as the Saul story plays out, and God chooses someone who has none of the attributes of success in the world to become the king of Israel. In our next lesson, we meet David and the greatest challenge of his life. And once again, I think you're going to see some lessons for us in the church today, because we have a decision to make. Will we be the Davids of the world, or will we be the Sauls of the world? I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thank you.